Exactly 10 years ago, hockey fans witnessed one of the most thrilling and unpredictable years in league history. 2016. The NHL is constantly evolving each season. Sure, some teams are still hanging around in familiar spots, Florida, Tampa, Dallas, and yes, there were even different teams in the league like the Coyotes. Man, I miss those Kachina jerseys. But the real difference between 2016 and today is who's running the NHL. Back then, Kane and Taves were fresh off their third Stanley Cup championship in Chicago. The Pacific Division was largely dominated by California franchises, and Crosby and Ovechkin were the undisputed kings of the Metro. Well, that really hasn't changed much. This was the year the next generation of NHL superstars truly began to emerge. Connor McDavid was in the middle of his rookie season, while Austin Matthews was being drafted, beginning his era in Toronto. Undrafted rookies like Artemi Panarin were winning the Calder Trophy, and rebuilding franchises started to emerge as playoff contenders. Looking back now, so many of those first-year players have gone on to become household names across the league today, changing franchises and reshaping everything we once knew about the NHL. But even after all of this, I'm only scratching the surface of how special a year 2016 was for the NHL and its fans. So to fully understand, we need to take you all the way back to the very start. The 2015 season began like many before it, but when the calendar turned to 2016, fans were treated to the first of many unforgettable moments that year would bring. What started as a joke on a podcast quickly turned into the most feel-good story of the season. 6'8" enforcer John Scott was floated online as an all-star candidate. At first, it felt like a joke because Scott is not your typical all-star archetype, but eventually, the reality of him becoming an all-star began to sink in as an overwhelming number of votes poured in for the Coyotes enforcer. The NHL caught wind of what was going on and decided to let the voting play out, giving Scott a chance to make the All-Star games if that's what fans really wanted. Well, we all know now, never underestimate the power of the internet, because eventually Scott earned his spot, becoming Arizona's All-Star representative. And to top it all off, he even became the captain of the Pacific Division. This was the story that fans wanted. That is, until just days before the event, the Arizona Coyotes traded him to the Montreal Canadiens, sparking a fan conspiracy like no other. Fans were convinced that the league was trying to push Scott out, especially after reports surfaced that an NHL executive had encouraged him to step aside. Scott refused. Scott showed up in Nashville wearing a generic NHL jersey for the skills competition, but it was during the All-Star tournament that his story reached legendary status. Scott scored twice in the Pacific's win over the Central and was listed as a potential MVP candidate, which at that point, the writing was on the wall. The Pacific defeated the Atlantic to win the tournament, and John Scott was named All-Star MVP. The perfect ending to an incredible story. Following the All-Star game, the rest of the regular season played out, ending in mid-April as the playoffs were set to begin. But there was a big storyline from that season that many fans forget happened. Look at this playoff bracket and tell me what's missing. If you guessed that there were no Canadian teams in the playoffs, then you guessed right. For the first time in a generation, every Canadian-based franchise missed the playoffs. And frankly, none of them were even close. This was something that hadn't happened since 1970, back when the league had just 3 franchises from Canada. Now, there were 7, and somehow not a single one of them could earn enough points to make the playoffs. But thankfully, there was a silver lining. Connor McDavid and Austin Matthews were both selected first overall by Canada-based franchises in back-to-back drafts, changing this terrible narrative. But 2016 is definitely a year that a lot of those teams would like to forget. Before we jump into the next story, we need to take a quick step back. By the end of 2015, the Pittsburgh Penguins were a flat-out disaster. They had just fired their head coach, were barely hanging on to a playoff spot, and looked more like a collection of aging, overpaid stars than a real contender. But just a few months later, after swapping out their head coach, this team became the best in all of hockey. No team had a better 2016 than the Penguins. Led by Crosby, they closed out the year near the top of the NHL standings and became Stanley Cup champions once again after their win against the San Jose Sharks. Behind Crosby and these unlikely cup runs were a once-in-a-lifetime goalie swap with rookie Matt Murray taking over the net from Hall of Fame goalie Marc-Andre Fleury and backstopping the Pens to what later would be back-to-back cup runs. And then there was, of course, Phil Kessel, acquired the previous summer by the Penguins and eventually going on to be the leading scorer for them in their postseason run. No one is more loved than Phil the Thrill, and no one back in 2016 had a better year than the Pittsburgh Penguins. With the season now behind us, fans were back to square one. Play street hockey all summer long and impatiently wait for October to come around. But what we didn't expect was one of the most exciting and surprising off seasons that the NHL has ever seen. And it all kicked off on June 22nd. The NHL officially announced expansion to Las Vegas, making the Golden Knights the first from the 4 major North American professional leagues to call Vegas home. Since joining the NHL, Vegas has made 2 Stanley Cup final appearances and won a championship back in 2023, quickly establishing itself as both a premier destination for players and a team notorious for its aggressive roster building and ability to acquire top talent. The expansion was only the start of that unpredictable offseason, though. Now, there were some rumors floating around for some big-time players potentially being available on the market. For example, Steven Stamkos was up for a contract that year and was the main headliner for 2016. He eventually re-signed with Tampa Bay, taking that off the table, but still, it was exciting to potentially see him get moved. But on that same very day, there was a bombshell that dropped that still to this day gives me goosebumps. June 19th hits. Steven Stamkos re-signs, and then boom, out of nowhere, the hockey world explodes. The Nashville Predators and Montreal Canadiens pull off a blockbuster trade, swapping defenseman PK Subban for Shea Weber. Both defensemen were at the peak of their careers when this trade happened, and both teams were searching for a bold move to push themselves over the hump. Nashville would instantly benefit from this trade, getting all the way to the Stanley Cup final that very season, while Montreal eventually reached the final in 2021 with Weber still anchoring their blue line. In hindsight, it sort of worked out perfectly, I guess, for both teams, with them kind of reaching the same heights. But still, it was an incredible trade at the time, truly one of those one-for-one hockey trades that just blows your mind as a fan. After that trade, you would think that the offseason would be pretty calm, right? But buckle up, because there's another trade that happened that offseason that, again, with some hindsight, ended up being one of the most lopsided trades in NHL history. Coming off Connor McDavid's injury-shortened rookie season, the Edmonton Oilers found themselves in a painfully familiar territory, the bottom of the Pacific Division. Oilers GM at the time, Peter Chiarelli, wanted to make some changes to the lineup, looking for a top defenseman to help improve the team's back end. And Adam Larson of the New Jersey Devils was seen as the perfect fit. So the Oilers took a gamble, trading former first overall pick Taylor Hall to the New Jersey Devils in a 1-for-1 swap for Adam Larson. And man, was this a bad gamble for the Oilers to take. Yes, Larson ended up having some good seasons in Edmonton, and yes, the Oilers badly needed a right-handed shutdown defenseman. But the price was simply way too high. To make matters worse, the money once set aside for Hall was used to sign Milan Lucic, who gave the team one decent season before the deal quickly went south. Meanwhile, Taylor Hall went on to have an MVP caliber campaign in 2017-2018, winning the Hart Trophy with the New Jersey Devils and continuing to carve out a strong NHL career as a middle six forward. Edmonton fans to this day are still trying to wrap their heads around this move, but looking back, it's hard to argue with anyone that the Edmonton Oilers came out on top in this one. Do you remember a few moments ago when I mentioned that fans had to impatiently wait till October for the season to start? Well, I wasn't exactly being truthful. International hockey and the NHL have had their ups and downs over the years, but the NHL has done a spectacular job to try and deliver on some form of best on best. The Four Nations this past year, for example, and back in 2016, the World Cup of Hockey. The 2016 World Cup of Hockey took place right before the season from September 17th to September 29th, and featured a wide range of teams from Canada, the United States, Sweden, and Finland, all the way to Russia, Team Europe, and the wildly fun and popular Team North America, which essentially was a combination of young players from the United States and Canada put together. Every game was high energy and exciting, with the Final Four coming down to Russia, Canada, Europe, and Sweden. But real fans know that Team North America was by far the most fun to watch. Canada and Europe would face off in the final, with the Canadians winning 2-1 to secure the championship. But all in all, the execution of this event and the excitement it brought ahead of the season was hands down one of the most memorable moments in a year, filled with some pretty crazy storylines. But this is still only scratching the surface of all the incredible things that happened in a fun-packed year that was 2016. And I would be remiss to at least not mention some of these other things, so let's quickly go through those. January 1st, the Boston Bruins lose to the Montreal Canadiens at Gillette Stadium during their Winter Classic 5-1. June 10th, the unfortunate passing of a hockey legend, Gordie Howe, at age 88. June 24th to 25th, Austin Matthews is taken first overall in the NHL's entry draft in Buffalo, New York. October 19th, we get to see a high-profile rookie matchup between Austin Matthews and Patrick Laine. You know, when those debates were still being had about which player was best. October 23rd, the NHL Heritage Classic, where the Edmonton Oilers defeat the Winnipeg Jets 3-0. And November 11th, Hockey Hall of Fame game in Toronto, honoring the class of 2016 with some amazing names that you can see right here. But where were you in 2016? And do you remember any of these crazy events? Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Be sure to toss it a thumbs up and subscribe for more stuff like this.